Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere, and welcome to the Real Finds podcast, where we have real conversations with key entrepreneurs, activists, and researchers, shaping the real estate industry and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we'll be speaking with Joshua Bandoch. Joshua is head of policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. He joins me for an in-depth conversation about the housing crisis in Illinois and the broader Midwest. We break down the lay of the land, where the state has succeeded, where it has stumbled, and how our neighbors are setting an example worth studying. We also dig into the ways that politicians have tried and often failed to create lasting housing solutions. Most importantly, Joshua explains why the conversation about housing abundance doesn't belong to one political side. It's an issue with bipartisan urgency, and the real innovations are happening in towns and cities across America. If you're interested in real steps to solve Illinois and America's housing crisis, today's podcast is well worth a listen. Josh, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
Gordon, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So what got you into the world of real estate and kind of real estate policy?
Housing. Because housing, it is one of the most important things that every family and every community faces. It's just from a purely financial standpoint, it's the biggest line item in every family's budget. And we know that a lot of families are struggling right now with housing costs. And it's something that can make a community and a city and a state either really attractive or unattractive. So it's where your kids live and where they go to school. It's one of the most important things that every individual deals with.
So how do we make housing more affordable for people or more accessible?
So our kind of North Star with our housing policy at the Illinois Policy Institute is that we want housing abundance, which means that we want more housing of all shapes and sizes to meet diverse needs. Some people might need a huge home and some people might need a tiny home. And we want more housing to fit that. And we know, and a lot of good research shows, that the best way to make housing more affordable is to increase supply. That's everywhere that's been tried, it's worked. And everywhere where you see low supply, typically prices go up. That's just Econ 101, and all the research supports that. So that's really big picture, build more, have more housing options, and happy to talk about lots of ways we can do that here in Illinois.
Yeah, so how do you build more housing? Because everywhere you look, I mean, I don't care if you look at CNBC, Wall Street Journal, or you're just someone on the ground like me, it's increasingly difficult to build housing in a lot of states. So how do we tackle that challenge of creating housing abundance?
Totally. And I think it's good to just acknowledge at the top that there's only so much that policy can do. So somebody in the policy world, we don't control interest rates, right? Politicians, they don't control interest rates. And that is one cost of housing. My wife and I bought a home in 2021. We have interest rate under 3%. Right now, we get an interest rate about 6.5%. Things like that are out of control of the policy process. So what can the policy world do, and what are some of the biggest barriers to building more housing, particularly in Illinois? So I think one of the biggest pain points is the permitting process. So the Census Bureau every year, they look at the numbers for new privately owned housing units authorized per 100,000 people. The national average is 435 units per 100,000 people. North Carolina authorizes 862 units, so it's about double the national average. Florida and Texas are in the 700s. Remember, the national average is 435. Illinois is at 160, which means it's about 1/3 the national average, and it's about 5 times less than North Carolina. What does that mean? It means it is way too hard, and it takes way too long to get new housing authorized in Illinois. So that's one of the biggest pain points. Developers know this. They just want it to be easier to build, build, build. And one of the challenging realities is that many of them are saying, well, really tough to build in Illinois. We can take our money and invest in North Carolina, Texas, Florida instead. So that would be one of the biggest things we'd recommend is making the permitting process easier and streamlining it. That means having online permitting that can go a lot faster. In Chicago, it's extremely slow to get things permitted. So that's kind of one of the big picture things. Happy to talk about other things, but I'll just pause there for a minute.
So why do you think that is, and why do you think it's uh, been increasingly difficult in Illinois to build housing over the years? It would just seem to me, there might be some reasons for that, either structural or major players.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, what are you seeing?
I think that unfortunately, Illinois and Chicago in particular are overregulated. And the impulse of regulations is understandable. It's look, we want to have safety regulations in place. We want to make sure that things are done properly, that, for example, communities maintain their character. So we don't want too much building in various communities. So the impulses of these things are understandable. The result, unfortunately, has been that just Illinois as a whole is vastly overregulated. So there's a think tank that looks at the number of essentially regulations in a state's legal code. And Illinois has more than double the national average. It's one of the five most regulated states. It has Idaho is the lowest, and Idaho is, let me do the math. Illinois is about 8 or 9 times more regulated than Idaho. And the Idahoans haven't, it hasn't fallen into. So there is this impulse to kind of regulate in an effort to make things better. That means that in all spaces, including housing, it's really hard to do things. What's an example of this? So in Chicago, the permitting code is actually stricter in many cases than the international standards. So that developers have to do more in Chicago than what they would have to do in almost any other city. And we don't hear buildings collapsing in Paris and London and places like that. So we don't need to have super crazy rigorous standards to maintain safety.
And so when we're talking about some of these standards, what are the states that are applying standards that are like lower? What do they look like, and is it effective at creating housing abundance?
Yeah, so I think the three states that I mentioned earlier are good examples. And then so those are North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. And even just as a point of comparison, it isn't simply, oh, well, those are just Sun Belt states. New York authorizes about twice as many units as this is the city, not the state. New York City authorizes about twice as many units as Chicago, and LA authorizes about 3 times as many. What's been happening in LA and California as a whole is that they've recognized that they do have a housing affordability crisis and that low supply is a primary driver. So California actually has taken some good strides to make it easier to build and to good effect. So we don't read stories about all these homes collapsing in LA or New York, to say nothing of North Carolina and Florida and Texas. So the standards are still rigorous, but the standards in Chicago, in particular, are too tight for what's necessary for safety.
So it's in your opinion, it's a particularly Illinois problem, not necessarily even a southeast or a red state, blue state problem. Are there blue states besides New York and California that are doing this well? Because like I hear in development circles, and from people who are across the political spectrum, that Illinois is particularly difficult to get things done. And these are developers that work in New York, California, all across the spectrum. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
It is, and we'll get to this later. There are some reasons to be a little bit optimistic, and I'll be happy to flag those because I don't want to only be doom and gloom. And the first step is admitting you have a problem, and I think that Illinois is getting there. So we'll come back to that. I just want to kind of plant that little seed. I would say yes, broadly speaking, Illinois is just harder. What makes it easier in California, at least easier than it was 5, 10 years ago, is this recognition and a bipartisan consensus that it's a big problem. So Illinois does seem to be harder. Are there other blue states that are, or blue area cities that are doing well? One really good example is Minneapolis. 2018 or 19, they instituted a number of reforms in the city to make it easier to build. And we've done some research on this, and you see rents in Minneapolis are going up much less sharply than they are in Chicago, and housing supply is increasing more than it is in Chicago. So it's only, 7 or 8 hours up the road. A cold city. We all think Chicago is cold. Minneapolis is colder. So that's a good example of a city that said we have a problem, and the way to do it is to make it easier to build and to expand supply.
So, what are some of these barriers that we can knock down? Like, if you're sitting there and you're the alderman or the mayor or Governor Pritzker, what are some of the barriers that you can break down to create housing abundance?
Well, the biggest barrier is a recognition that we have a problem. And the happy reality is that Governor Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson, Chicago mayor, um, they are realizing there's a problem. And mayors of other cities that I've talked to across Illinois also realize we do have a unique problem here, that it is worse here than other places. In About a year and a half ago, Mayor Johnson issued a report called Cut the Tape, recognizing that the enormous number of regulations in Chicago are a problem. Governor Pritzker last fall released a report about the missing middle, talking about how essentially middle income families are feeling the pinch in particular. So the biggest barrier is starting to break down, and there is a bipartisan recognition of both the causes, low supply, and what causes that? Well, lots of regulations, and the solution is more housing. So that's the biggest barrier. Because if you can't get past that and you don't recognize that there's a problem, then there's really no conversation after that. So then specifically, what are some of the things that we would recommend that we do see some appetite for? Happily, one of the reforms that Minneapolis adopted that we have been pushing for a while, that happily City Council approved 2 months ago, back in July, is to reduce parking minimums near public transit. So it is now, I think it's within 0.75 miles of public transit. I could double check the ordinance. There are no parking minimums for large units. And that makes sense. I live about a 5-minute walk from a red line stop. That makes it easy peasy. I don't need a car. Many people in my neighborhood don't have cars because it's expensive and there's no parking. So they pay more money specifically to be within walking distance of public transportation. Buses, we have good bus system here. So that would be one that Chicago has adopted, and we would love to see that expand, right? So more areas in Chicago, not just close to public transportation. If people decide they don't need a car, great, and let developers make that decision. Because if they build a 50 or 100 unit building without parking, they have done the market analysis and they have said, look, we believe that there are 50 or 100 individuals or families who want to live here. We're not going to lose money on this. They just don't need parking. And there are a lot of cities across the state that also have parking minimums. Sometimes it's 2 parking spots for 1 unit. It's like, well, I mean, a lot of people don't have and certainly don't need 2 cars. So reduce those minimums. With, I think, Chicago making a really good step there, that's positive. We'd also like just to see other kinds of housing be permissible. So accessory dwelling units, things like coach houses, granny flats, English basements, those sorts of things. A lot of cities, a lot of localities in Illinois don't allow them. In Chicago, it's really hard to build an ADU, accessory dwelling unit. There are only 5 little pilot areas in the city, and there are a lot of problems with that pilot project. So we've seen fewer, I think, than 100. I could double check that, but it's fewer than 100 units built when we did our research on this last year. So we've published a ton of stuff advocating for more accessory dwelling units because this is a great way to build wealth, particularly for minority families. So you can just add an English basement, add a granny flat, add a coach house. It's a great way to care for your loved ones, particularly aging family members. And it's a great way to maintain the character of the community, because putting that English basement, putting that granny flat is still the same structure. Putting something in your backyard, you're going to want it to look similar to how your house looks. The positive news, and it's good news, but it's positive, is that in July, the zoning committee passed an ordinance to make it much easier to build ADUs. That is now awaiting full city council, which they'll meet September 25th. So we would love to see city council authorize that. We would love to see more cities, more localities in Illinois make it easier to build these units. Families can build wealth and you give people a place to live. Also, access to better schools. Because if you can get an accessory dwelling unit for your family in Lincoln Park or Lakeview, you're going to have access to better schools than if you're in a neighborhood that's maybe not so nice.
Where's the pushback coming against ADUs? I'm just curious because it seems like there's a lot of societal pushback from a variety of housing options. It just seems like that would be one of the lesser areas of pushback.
So they we, we know, by the way, that they are really successful. Los Angeles permits allows them pretty much by right, meaning like people can build them really easily. And through when we did our research last year, like 17,000 from 2018, I think, until 2024, 17,000 ADUs have been built in LA. So we know there's demand for this in other cities. What's the pushback? I think there's a couple of pieces of pushback. People are concerned about parking. And I would say, look, I live in a 3 flat. And if they wanted to build a coach house in our backyard, it would actually fit. And that doesn't have a parking spot. That means that the individual has said, hey, I don't need a parking spot. And that's
Yeah.
okay. But people are concerned about parking, and I get it. And part of the question we have to ask is, how do we best maintain the character of our communities and make it welcoming to families? And I think we do that by having more housing options available rather than fewer options. So that's some of the pushback. Some of the pushback is that, and I think this is one of the challenging realities of working in certain cities like Chicago, is that some people like to have control over things. They like to determine, and this isn't just politicians, this is people in the community. They like things to look a certain way and to be a certain way, and they're reluctant to change that. So I think that is also part of the pushback. I mean, people are concerned about infrastructure and things like that, and that's something that I think is fairly easy to address.
So one of the things that you know, if you read the Wall Street Journal, at least over the last 5 years, you'd think that we're seeing a massive transformation of adaptive reuse. And they would say that, so much of it is easy to address and easy to fix and adapt some of our current dysfunction in our commercial real estate markets. I'm curious what you're seeing with the adaptive reuse projects in Chicago and if they've been generally successful and kind of where they might be falling short.
Well, so this is another area for optimism, and I think Chicago is in the early stages of testing out some good things here. So I think it was in April, City Council passed ordinance allowing um, conversion of first floor commercial units to housing. So that's only been in place for 3+ months. So that's the kind of option where you can start to convert some commercial property to a home. And I think the vacancy rate in Chicago is in the mid to high 20% for commercial properties, which is really high. So I think it's an area where I would like to see more experimentation. We don't have enough data 3 months out to know whether that commercial conversion has been successful. You'd probably need 2 or 3 years, and then you need to still know, like, okay, well, it's allowed, but is it really happening? I do think that's a ripe area, though. I mean, you walk around downtown, and a lot of buildings, they're having trouble finding commercial tenants. Let residential tenants live there. Try it out. So I don't think Chicago has done a ton on that front. I think it's an area that people are realizing is ripe. I work in the Loop, and there are lots of buildings that people would love to live in if they could. But the reality is that only 21% of Chicago is zoned for multifamily housing, and a lot of it is commercial, which meaning you can't build any residential here.
Yeah. Have we seen serious zoning reform happen on the Chicago or in Illinois state level? And is that probably the biggest path forward when we're talking about you know making it easier to create an abundant housing society?
I think that's the biggest elephant in the room. And, You don't address an elephant by ignoring it. So let's talk zoning, right? And I mean, I think also you don't eat an elephant in one sitting either. So all things being equal, we would love to see a zoning code that is extremely permissible. And I think that that has to happen in steps. So what does the zoning code in Illinois look like? Illinois has the second strictest land use regulation in the Midwest. And the Midwest comparison is really helpful because sometimes national, right, like developers, they can invest in Florida or Texas instead. But if you look at, say, geography, right, you can look at Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa and Indiana, et cetera. And then you can say, well, like, do any of these regulations for land use have anything to do with geography? And when Illinois is the second most regulated, and I think the worst, this is maybe data from 2 years ago, I think the worst might have been Minnesota, but with those reforms I talked about, Illinois might be, when the new data come out from this particular research institution, Illinois might be the worst. So it's not weather, it's not geography. It's a choice that policymakers make, and that is to make it hard to build. And a lot of that has to do with zoning policy and other land use regulations. So Illinois is highly restrictive, and Chicago in particular is restrictive. So 41% of Chicago is single family only. Now, do we necessarily want to see 40 building high rises go up in small neighborhoods? No. And what would be a good way to maintain the character of the community? Well, you could allow 2, 3, or 4 flats by right, so that instead of building a single family home, you could build 3-unit building. I live in a 3 flat, and that still maintains the character of the community. I live in Wrigleyville, and building looks totally fine. Or that could be a 6 or 8 bedroom huge home, and so zoning is a big issue. This is something that localities control. There is the option for states to get involved. We would rather see this adjudicated at the local level, and if things are still this way in a couple of years, then it's a conversation of whether folks down in Springfield, elected officials, if they might want to consider being more involved, because when housing is unaffordable, people leave those communities and sometimes even leave those states. So there aren't ever any simple fixes in the public policy process, and you have to assess which problem is bigger. And for us, breakdown of communities and housing unaffordability are enormous issues.
I know there's not probably a magic bullet, but if there was a bullet that at least did substantial damage to some of the problems that exist, what would that, problem solver be?
Well, the two biggest ones that really make it hard to build are strict zoning regulations and an extremely slow permitting process. So I think you address the strict zoning regulations in steps. You don't go from single family to by right in 100% of the city. That's, it's going to be a little bit too much for everybody. So you do it in steps, and you find reasonable reforms that, okay, let's get some buy-in for this, get a little bit more buy-in. So like I said, maybe we go from single family to up to 4 flats of by right, or up to 3 flats. Try that, see how it does. We know all the developers I've talked to, they are so hungry to build in Chicago because this is a great big city. And that's true across Illinois, right? They want to build. And if they can make money, they'll build. It's just that things don't pencil out in a lot of cases. The second would be to streamline the permitting process. And there are a couple ways you can do that. One way is to put more things online. Another is to look at the regulations like the building code and say, well, if this is notably stricter than like international standards, that might be too strict and it might be too onerous. It might make it too expensive. Maybe extremely safe is safe enough, and it doesn't have to be even stricter than international standards. And then one of the kind of forcing functions you can have is you can say after a certain number of days, it's probably 60, 30 is probably too short, but after a certain number of days, projects are automatically approved, particularly if you have something called self-certification, which is that an architect can say, I certify this as safe. And then essentially it's their reputation and their certification on the line. If something's been certified, streamline the permitting process and require the state to not let things languish for months and months and months and months, because a developer, that's just money that's tied up, and that's homes that aren't being built. And you do that over many, many projects over many, many years, and you're down tens of thousands of units of housing across the state.
So I know there's a lot of doom and gloom in the podcast already, but not everything is doom and gloom in Illinois. There are some things that look like they're getting better, and I'm curious, where do you see some of those bright spots, both on the state level and within the regions itself and the municipalities?
Well, and that's why I said I wanted to plant a seed in this for optimism, because it would be easy to stop here and say, "Oh man, um, these are a mess here." And I'm actually really optimistic that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see lots of really good, positive reforms at the local level and at the state level. So at the local level, I've met with elected officials in a number of areas. Uh, I won't say where that is, but these are some of the larger cities in Illinois, and there is real appetite to make this better. I already mentioned the report from Governor Johnson that came out in spring of 2024 called Cut the Tape, Governor Pritzker's report from last year. There is recognition across the aisle that we have a problem and that the solution is more housing. There are lots of great housing advocates down in Springfield. One that comes to mind in particular is Cam Buckner. He's been a powerful voice for more housing. And there are a lot of folks like that down in Springfield. So my optimism is first that people really are recognizing that there's a problem, and that you can look at other states that did a great job of addressing this that are red states. They've employed the same formula. Montana, for example, of all places, right? Montana has done a great job making it much easier to build because they were facing a housing crunch in their larger cities. And they have also instituted the same kinds of reforms that we recommend. So there is a growing consensus, and that makes me optimistic. There's also, the flip side of Illinois having a problem where some people are saying the state's too unaffordable, is that elected officials are seeing that. And they're saying, well, we need to address that. We need to address it because we want to keep our communities together. We want to maintain them, and we want to actually make Illinois a magnet for people to come to. And if you look at Chicago and the broader area and Illinois, there's so much that speaks for this area. We have phenomenal universities here, two of the very best universities in the whole world, in the University of Chicago and Northwestern. And you have lots of other good local universities. So there is so much human capital here. There is a heavy investment in the future of technology. There's even a quantum facility going up. So there are lots of things that draw people to Chicago and Illinois. Great transportation, access to two major airports, all these sorts of things a lot of areas just don't have. So when you're thinking about where to live as a family and where to invest as a corporation or as a business, Chicago has so much that speaks for it. So it is a magnet, and one of the things holding it back is housing. And a lot of the firms that we recommended, I could point you to left of center research organizations, the policy organizations, and right of center research organizations. And if I just covered up the top of the report and just showed you that paragraph, you wouldn't know who wrote what. You wouldn't know if it was coming from a left or right of center organization making policy recommendations, because the recommendations really are quite similar.
Yeah, I mean, you see a podcast with Ezra Klein talking to Jon Stewart, or you see a podcast on, one of the Fox News hosts. They're saying generally the same things. I don't think this is a partisan issue. Um, in terms of also kind of nonpartisan issues, I'm curious, how is Brandon Johnson's cutting the red tape worked in Chicago? Do you see a bright future there? Have we not done enough? Kind of what's going on with that within Chicago itself?
I think that initially it was a little slow to get going, and I am optimistic that we've seen some good reforms in 2025 and that there's slowly a little bit of growing momentum. So I mentioned the commercial conversion of first floor properties that happened this year. Parking minimums were eliminated near transportation. That's really big because that means you can put up a 50 or 100 unit building and not have to worry about having 50 or 100 parking spots. That's great. Governor Johnson has also been an advocate, or not Governor, sorry, Mayor Johnson, apologize. Mayor Johnson also been an advocate for significantly expanding accessory dwelling units. So I went and testified for that ordinance at the zoning committee back in July, and he was one of the sponsors of that ordinance. So if that gets pushed through, That's big because I said in 6 years, LA saw 17,000 new units. Maybe Chicago sees 5,000 over a similar period, just in sort of roughly comping the size of the cities. That'd be huge. So those are good steps. And if we can see that get pushed through and more things move through, um, that would be a lot of momentum behind it. So I think 2024 is a little slow. 2025 is better. And if 2026 builds off of the momentum in 2025, that would be great.
So before we get into our final four, which is always kind of a fun little wrap up, I just wanted to ask one final question. And ultimately, what is it that we haven't covered yet on the podcast that if you have a developer or a policy holder or a policy creator, I should say, that's listening to this podcast, what do you think is the most important thing we should be talking about in terms of housing abundance?
I think the challenging thing for folks is that they see that housing is unaffordable, and it is. It's expensive, and this hurts low income people the most. And middle income families struggle. It's why a lot of them have to move out of the city, even though they love the city. And the impulse as a result of that, say, okay, look, we need to do something. We need to regulate things. We need to implement policies that are meant to make housing more affordable. Chicago, for example, and other couple of other cities in Illinois do as well. They have what's called inclusionary zoning, which means that there are affordability requirements above structures 10 units or above. So the impulse is, look, we're going to require developers to make things affordable. This is the same impulse that's behind rent control. And I totally get it because say, look, this is the best way to help people who can least shoulder the burdens of high housing costs. And the challenging reality is that those don't work. We have a report coming out about a week or two on this. And kind of broadly speaking, the regulations, while I get the impulse, they don't work. And one of the challenging realities when you look at the housing market or any other market is that if you let it kind of function, developers are going to look where opportunities are. People are going to go live where they want to live, and things do eventually sort themselves out. That doesn't mean that there's a perfect solution. It does mean that that's kind of the least bad solution. And it's the best pathway to housing abundance is to let developers, let renters, let all these people figure out where there are needs and to meet those needs based on homeowners, based on tenants. It's hard though, because the impulse is no, we have to make sure that we do things so that certain things happen. And then the sad consequence of that is that you have less housing and it's harder to build and the problem compounds over time.
Yeah. So when we talk about compounding over time, I think we're going to talk a little bit about time when we get into our final four. It's not a nice little wrap up, and it's a nice way to learn a little bit more about you, a little bit more about housing, and kind of wrap up the podcast. So, one of my favorite questions is always 10 years from now, what do you think is going to change the most about kind of how we see housing, particularly in Illinois?
I do think that we're at the start of a movement where people start to embrace housing abundance. I think you're seeing that across the state. You're seeing that with elected officials. You're seeing that with a wide coalition of organizations. We work with folks on the left and the middle and the right on this issue. And on the housing issue, people really are seeing the same things and recommending a lot of the same solutions. And I am optimistic as we start to see some early successes that they're going to grow and that as you have those early successes, people get less uncomfortable and maybe eventually comfortable with some of the bigger policy shifts that we talked about as options today. So I think in 10 years that, I mean, partially out of necessity and then
Yeah.
just out of like growing comfort and growing sensibility that look, as challenging as it is to kind of let developers and let tenants and let the market figure things out, it's worked in other places. We've tried it a little bit in Chicago. We tried it a little bit across Illinois. That worked. Let's try a little bit more. Let's try a little bit more. Let's try a little bit more.
So we always like to go forward and we also like to go back. We have a lot of people that I would say are under 30 that listen to the podcast that are involved in real estate from a variety of levels. And I'm curious if you could give advice to young Joshua, what would that be?
Oh, it's a good question. Do you mean in the housing space or just in general?
Just in general. Yeah.
Ooh, that's me a lot. Um, Let me think for a second. Something that I've come to embrace. It comes from a poem from Samuel Beckett called Worsford Hoe. Just to properly cite it, there are 6 lines in it that I think are extremely powerful. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail again, fail better. And it is through purposeful failure that we human beings learn to succeed. If you're in the real estate space and that first property you buy, oh my God, it's a disaster. Right? Figure out the next one, right? You'll find the right contractors, you'll find the right people who can fix things. And it's in your professional space, right? Like if you're not pushing yourself to your limits and a little bit beyond, you're not growing. And you're kind of stuck in the same spot you were while other people are improving. So don't be afraid to fail better as long as the failure isn't catastrophic, right? Don't climb Mount Everest without the proper clothes, right? You don't want to freeze up there. Don't be afraid to fail better.
Yeah, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger in this business. That's for sure. I'm curious. One of the ways that we like to get stronger is through books or podcasts or anything that we can kind of learn from. Because so often we spend our days grinding in real estate, and we don't always get to expand our minds and kind of how we see the world. So I'm curious if you have any media that our listeners should be recommended.
In terms of like a podcast that I like that's been really helpful.
Yeah, or it could be a book that you picked up. Just something that our listeners should pick up.
I think in the real estate business, it's really easy just to be overcome by the craziness that any day can bring to you. If you're a realtor, you got to respond, boom, like that. And it's probably easy to then kind of lose sometimes the big, big, big picture. So, an author, he's also a podcaster who's been really helpful for me. His name is Cal Newport. His It's a book that really put him on the map. It's a book called Deep Work. He has a podcast, I believe it's called Deep Questions with Cal Newport. And he really preaches kind of doing the most important things. And I think that applies in the real estate world too, just like it does in my professional life. What are the most important things and prioritize them? And he's really good about systematizing that because he's a computer scientist in his other life. So figure out what those big things are, systematize them, make sure that they get done. And some of the other things, if they don't happen or they don't happen right away, that's okay. As long as you're doing those big things in 5, 10, 20 years, consistently doing those big things really well is going to compound in a way that is so powerful that you'll look back and you'll think, oh my God, I did that. Um, that's it's true for me. I'm publishing a book on persuasion next year, and that's almost a decade of work, and it just compounded over time into a product I'm really happy with. But that was just systematically one of the most important things I did for nearly a decade.
I think that's terrific advice. I would say um, there's so much we do in life that uh, isn't deep work and isn't important. And so finding those crucial points is critical. I think when we're looking at this, the whole crucial point of this podcast is to reach out to great voices and have great recommendations on top of that. And so I'm going to wrap up with our final question that we always love to ask is what's the next person that's influencing the world of real estate that we should have on the podcast?
Question. Let me think for a second. Who's really good on this space? If you wanted to talk to a really powerful advocate in the city, Bennett Lawson is a great alderman. I mentioned Kim Buckner. He's also a real leader on this issue. Those are 2 of the elected officials who come to mind. Um, Mike Glasser, he runs the Voting Association. He's also a really powerful voice for these things. They're all just great advocates for more housing. They do a really good job with advocacy. They are just all across the aisle talking to people, and I really respect them. So those would be 3 people that come to mind.
I'd love to reach out to them. And if somebody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to get in contact?
So, Illinois Policy Institute, you can find us at illinoispolicy.org. And then you can find me on there, my email and everything, LinkedIn. Happy to connect with anybody. So that's a good way to find us and a good way to find me. And if you just Google my name, you'll see that I'm publishing a book next year on persuasion called How to Get What You Want. which is would be extremely useful to real estate folks who are looking to get what you want. So I'll plug my book for a second. Check out Illinois Policy and check me out there, and be in touch, please.
Well, I'd love to get a little bit more of a conversation with you in the future. That'd be something I think a lot of our listeners would want. And thank you so much, Josh, for hopping on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Joshua. We appreciate his insights. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a 5-star rating, and a review. Your comments, interactions, and subscriptions truly matter and help us continue to provide quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for watching.